The rain had been falling for 6 hours straight when Marcus Webb dragged the body out of the crater. He didn't know it was a body at first. The thing was half buried under slag and smoking wreckage, one limb visible through the char, long, multi-jointed, the color of old bone. He thought it was a piece of hull plating. He thought a lot of things in those first minutes after the battle, most of them wrong, because his ears were still ringing from the detonation that had taken out Fire Team Kestrel and left him the only human being within 4 kilometers of Outpost Vyerk. He'd been a soldier long enough to know what alone meant on this planet. It meant dead, usually, just a matter of timing. The Davari had been pushing the Corvith line for 11 days. That was what Command called it, the Corvith line, as if drawing a name around a thing could hold it in place. Marcus had watched 3 lines get names and 3 lines get erased, and he'd learned to stop believing in cartography. What he believed in was the weight of the rifle across his back, the emergency medkit on his thigh, and the particular texture of silence that meant the enemy had moved on. The silence right now said the enemy had moved on. He knelt beside the half-buried shape and pushed the slag away with his forearm, and that was when the shape moved. Marcus had his sidearm out before he'd finished the thought. He held it level, one knee on the wet ground, rain tapping off the barrel, and waited. The shape moved again, a spasm, not a lunge. Like something trying to sit up and failing. He heard a sound that might have been language coming from somewhere near the top of the form, a sequence of clicking consonants wrapped in a low, resonant hum. He didn't recognize the dialect. He spoke 3 words of Davari and 2 of them were obscenities, but he knew enough of the general phonemic family to understand that this was not it. He pulled more slag away. What he uncovered was the torso of a Corvith warrior. He'd fought alongside Corvith for 8 months. He knew their silhouette, the elongated neck, the wide, flat shoulder plates that served as both armor and heat dispersal surface, the 4 long fingers on each of 3 hands. What he hadn't seen before was one that wasn't moving under its own power. The Corvith didn't get injured in ways that left them ambulatory. They either walked off the field or they didn't walk at all. That was the thing Command always mentioned in the briefings, the thing that made the Allied ground commanders uncomfortable. Corvith biology had an almost absolute threshold. Either the organism was fully functional or it was not an organism. Except this one was something in between. She was, and Marcus registered this word without fully understanding why, alive, alert. Her upper visual organs were open and oriented on him. The clicking sounds were continuing in a low, measured cadence. Her shoulder plates had taken catastrophic damage. One was sheared clean off, the other cracked lengthwise from a weapon strike that had also carved a deep groove along the left side of her neck column. The lower half of her body was pinned under the hull section. He could see from the way she held herself that she couldn't feel it. He'd seen enough spinal trauma to recognize the presentation, the stillness in the lower limbs. The way the clicking sounds were controlled, deliberate. She was managing pain through vocalization, working through something that had no good medical outcome without equipment Marcus did not have. He considered his options, which took approximately 4 seconds. Option 1, leave her. The Corvith had their own extraction protocols. If she was still alive when her side got to her, they'd handle it. He had a 40-kilometer walk to the nearest friendly position, and the Davari were somewhere between here and there. Option 2, end it. He'd seen Allied troops do this for each other. Quick, merciful. She couldn't consent in a language he understood, and the math of her injuries was not encouraging. Option 3 was the one that made no tactical sense at all. Marcus Webb had grown up in a town in eastern Georgia where the one thing everybody understood without being taught was that you didn't leave a person in a ditch. Not a person. Not if you could help it. That rule had a corollary that nobody said out loud. It applied to people who didn't look like you, too. His grandmother had been very specific about this. She'd had a way of making specific things feel like physics, Inviolable, load-bearing, part of the structure of the actual universe. He put the sidearm away and started shifting hull plating. It took 40 minutes. The section of wreckage across her lower body weighed more than a standard personnel transport and had to be moved in pieces, which meant Marcus went looking through the debris field for anything that could serve as a lever. He found a structural strut. He found another. He sweated through his jacket in the rain, working the levers with his boots braced against whatever held firm, talking to her the whole time, not because she could understand him, not because he could understand her, but because the sound of a voice, any voice, does something to a person working alone in the dark. He said things like, "Okay, this piece is going to shift about 20 degrees, so brace yourself, and I've got the one on the left, give me a minute." And once, when the third strut slipped and he fell backward into the mud, "Son of a bitch, sorry, 1 second." She watched him. Every time he looked up, her visual organs were on him, not the blank tracking reflex of an animal, something with weight behind it, something trying to work out what exactly it was seeing. When the last section came free, she tried to rise and couldn't. Her lower limbs did nothing. She made a sound Marcus had not heard from a Corvith before, not the clicking language, not the resonant combat tones. Something lower, something that didn't need translation. He set up camp in the shelter of a buckled wall. It wasn't much of a camp. He had his field pack, which contained 2 days of rations, a water purification unit, a basic med kit that had been designed for human anatomy and was therefore largely useless for Corvith biology, and the emergency thermal sheet that was supposed to protect him from hypothermia. He spread the thermal sheet and got her onto it, which required figuring out how to move a paralyzed, 6-limbed organism without causing additional injury, a problem that had no entry in his field manual. He did it anyway. He sat with his back against the wall, rifle across his knees, watching the rain come down through the gaps in the wreckage overhead. The Davari patrol signature had moved northwest. He had the sensor array from his helmet still functional, barely, giving him a 3-kilometer sweep. Nothing active in range. He ate half a ration bar. He gave the other half to the alien lying beside him, holding it out the way you'd offer something to a stray animal, with no expectation and no insistence. She looked at it for a long time. Then one of her 3 hands reached out and took it. He slept in shifts, 2 hours on and 2 hours watching, which was not enough and was also the only option available. Sometime in the deep hours before dawn she spoke. Full sentences measured, the clicking language shaped around something that sounded like structure, like argument. He listened with his whole attention and understood nothing. Then she stopped, and after a pause she made a single sound, short, hard, that he recognized because every language had a version of it. A question. "Marcus," he said, pointing to his chest. "My name is Marcus Webb." She repeated the sounds back to him. They came out somewhat wrong, the consonants displaced, but recognizably his name reshaped by a vocal architecture that hadn't evolved for it. "Yeah," he said, "that's right." She made the sequence of sounds again, this time pointing at herself. "K. Varath," he said. He probably mangled it. She made a sound he would later come to recognize as the Corvith equivalent of a resigned acceptance of inevitable mispronunciation, which turned out to be a single aspirated click that meant, more or less, close enough. He learned a lot of things about her over the next 18 hours. He learned she was a Cascade commander, a rank that had no direct human equivalent, but corresponded roughly to the officer responsible for coordinating 3 or 4 independent strike elements simultaneously. He learned this not from language, but from the insignia on the cracked shoulder plate, which he'd seen enough of to read at a basic level. He learned she had been in the forward position when the Davari air-to-ground strike came in, and that 2 things had happened in the same instant. The strike had taken out her neural lattice relay, the Corvith equivalent of a spinal control system, and the extraction team that had come for the rest of her command had evaluated her condition, determined she was non-functional, and left. He learned this last part because he found the extraction team's beacon trace on his sensor array, recorded in the passive log. They had been at this location 6 hours before Marcus arrived. They had departed on a northwest heading within 4 minutes of arrival. 4 minutes. He looked at the trace for a long time. Then he closed the sensor menu and didn't look at it again. The neural lattice relay was the key problem. Without it, the signals from her central nervous system weren't reaching her lower extremities. The relay was a biological-mechanical hybrid, partly organic tissue grown into the base of the neck column, partly a crystal matrix conductor woven through the vertebral analog. In healthy Corvus, it was invisible and automatic. In K-Varath, it was fractured at 2 points, severed at a third, and the crystal matrix had partially collapsed. He knew this because she showed him. She guided his hand to the back of her neck column, 3 soft taps on her own neck to indicate, then a gesture toward his hand that was unmistakably clinical, unmistakably a request, and he ran his fingers along the damaged tissue, reading it the way a field medic learns to read injuries in the dark. He felt where the break was. He felt the collapsed section. He felt with some surprise that the relay wasn't dead. There was still a faint oscillation in the crystal matrix, a signal trying and failing to bridge the gap. He sat back and thought about it. He had worked, before his military service, as an electronics technician in his father's repair shop. He had spent 3 years fixing whatever people brought in, machinery, communication devices, things that had been dropped or flooded or hit by lightning. His father's philosophy had been absolute and simple. Everything that had ever worked could be made to work again. It was a matter of understanding the path the signal was trying to take and clearing what was blocking it. He looked at his medkit. He looked at K-Varath. He looked at his medkit again. "This is going to be a stretch," he said. She made the sound he had started to think of as close enough. What he had that might be relevant. The medkit's micro-suture wire, which was a conductive monofilament designed for closing lacerations with minimal scarring. A surgical clamp, 2 milligrams of neuropathic stabilizer designed for human nerve tissue, a penlight, and the field-stripped actuator coil from his helmet's targeting system, which he'd been meaning to replace for 6 weeks. The actuator coil had a crystal matrix conductor. It wasn't the same matrix as Corvus biology. It was a manufactured approximation used in targeting systems, because the alien crystal structure happened to resonate at frequencies useful for signal amplification. The frequencies were not identical, but they were close. He worked for 3 hours. K-Varath held herself motionless with a discipline that Marcus found genuinely extraordinary. She didn't flinch, didn't tense, guided his hands with small, precise touches when he needed to know whether he was in the right place. The work required a flashlight in his teeth, his smallest tools, and a complete suspension of any belief that what he was doing was supposed to be possible. He bridged the first break with micro-suture wire. He cleared the collapsed section with the surgical clamp, which required patience he hadn't known he possessed. He set the actuator coil as a bypass around the severed section, anchored it with conductive adhesive from the medkit's wound seal compound, and held it in place while the adhesive cured. Then he sat back and waited. For 11 minutes, nothing happened. Then K-Varath made a sound he had never heard from her before, sharp, involuntary, her body rigid for a single instant, and her lower left limb moved. Not much, a tremor, a spasm of reconnected circuitry firing all at once, but it moved. She stared at him. He stared at her. "Yeah," he said, "I saw that too." She spoke for a long time. He didn't understand any of it. He suspected it was technical assessment, recalibration, the kind of internal monologue a soldier runs when something has changed and they're mapping the new reality. Then she stopped and looked at him again and said a single short phrase with a particular quality in it. Not a question. not a command. He'd heard that tone before. He'd used it himself, the morning after his squad had been pinned for 9 hours behind a burning supply depot, and a specialist named Okonkwo had kept them alive with 3 mag clips and an apparently supernatural ability to predict where the next volley was coming from. He'd said something to Okonkwo that morning that didn't have the right shape for thank you but meant it. Kvarath was saying something with exactly that shape. "Don't mention it," Marcus said. He meant it. They moved at dawn. Kvarath couldn't walk, but she could control her upper body, and the combination of her strength in her upper limbs and Marcus's ability to support her lower half produced a mode of movement that was neither walking nor being carried, but something in between. They had worked this out over the last hour of darkness, testing weight, testing balance, finding the rhythm, with the wordless pragmatism of 2 people who needed to cover ground and could not afford to be precious about how. The sensor array was showing Davari activity 12 kilometers north and moving east. That was good. The terrain between Outpost Vyark and the nearest Allied relay station was a dried riverbed that would give them cover but poor footing, which was less good. Marcus had revised his estimated travel time twice and was on his 3rd revision, and all 3 of them were too long. He didn't say this, he said, "We're heading southeast, you good?" She made the close enough sound. They walked. He told her about Georgia. Not because it was relevant, but because the sound of speech helped him pace himself, and because she seemed to listen, tracking his voice with her upper visual organs when she couldn't see his face, responding to shifts in his tone with small changes in her own. He told her about his father's shop, about the particular satisfaction of finding the break in a circuit and bridging it. He told her about Okonkwo, who had rotated out 8 weeks ago, and was somewhere in the northern sector being inexplicably good at keeping people alive. She told him things he couldn't understand, but he listened to the shape of them. There was a long passage that felt like complaint, flat, rhythmic, the clicking consonants tight and regular, the kind of tone a person uses when they're cataloging grievances. He said, "Yeah, I know," at intervals, and she seemed satisfied with this. There was a shorter passage that felt different, quieter, something that didn't have the shape of military language. He thought it might have been about someone she missed. He didn't ask. He said "yeah" in the quiet way, and she was quiet back, and they walked. At the 3rd hour, the sensor array gave him a warning tone. Davari patrol, 2 kilometers and closing from the northwest, which was not the direction the previous activity had been moving. He pulled them both into the cover of a collapsed earthwork, what had been a Corvith defensive berm, now reduced to a meter-high ridge of compacted soil, and they lay still. Kvarath had gone combat, still beside him without being told. She was reading the same information he was, somehow, tracking the vibrations in the soil, the particular quality of the air, some sensory apparatus he didn't have access to. She held up one hand, 3 fingers extended. 3 contacts. He hadn't picked that up yet. He watched his sensor array confirm it 15 seconds later. 3 Davari signatures moving in an open patrol formation, standard spacing, not searching, moving through. The patrol took 11 minutes to pass. Marcus spent most of it watching Kvarath's face, or what served as her face, the forward-facing surface of her head that contained her visual organs and her primary resonance chamber. He had spent enough time with Corvith soldiers to read a narrow vocabulary of expressions. What he was reading now was something he hadn't seen on a Corvith face before. It took him most of the 11 minutes to name it. She was doing math. Not battlefield math that he recognized, the focused blankness of tactical calculation. This was something else. This was the math a person does when they've been left somewhere and then unexpectedly not been left there, and they're trying to understand what the variables were that produced that outcome. The patrol passed. He waited 3 minutes. Then he said quietly, "Ready." She looked at him for a moment, that weighted look, that look that was trying to work something out. Then she said a phrase, short and deliberate, that he did not understand, but she said it with a particular quality he recognized. He thought she was asking why. "I grew up in a town where you don't leave people in ditches," he said. "It's kind of a whole thing." She looked at him for another second. Then she made the close enough sound, and they got up and walked. The relay station was a ruin. He'd expected this possibility but had been hoping against it, the way a soldier hopes against all the things they've seen happen before. The station had taken a direct Davari airstrike sometime in the last 24 hours. The comm tower was down. The secondary power systems were cycling in a damaged loop, the lights inside flickering at 3-second intervals, which meant there was still power but not enough of it and not steady enough to be useful. What the relay station still had was walls. And he discovered when he pushed through the main entry, navigating the collapsed section of the east wall with K. Vareth's weight against his side, a functioning emergency beacon in the subsurface bunker. The beacon was on its own power cell, which meant it was still transmitting. What it was transmitting was a distress signal on the Allied frequency, continuous, which was why nobody had come. The Davari had been controlling this airspace for 12 hours, and flying into it to answer a beacon meant dying on the way in. He found this out from the station's intact log terminal, which he could read because Corvith military log systems used an interface partially adapted from human-allied technical standards. He read through the logs while K. Vareth sat against the interior wall and ran her own assessment of her condition, testing each limb, mapping the signal, doing the Corvith equivalent of counting fingers after anesthesia. The log told him 3 things. 1. The last Allied aircraft to attempt a resupply run to this station had been shot down 17 kilometers south. The crew were listed as MIA. Marcus had his own thoughts about what that meant and kept them to himself. 2. The Davari air denial corridor was anticipated to shift at the boundary of the next solar cycle, in Corvith time notation, which he could approximately convert, roughly 14 to 16 hours from now. 3. There was a secondary message in the log that had been entered approximately 20 hours ago, flagged with a command priority marker. He read it twice to make sure he had it right. It was a general frequency notification from the Joint Command Coordination Office, the multi-species body that handled Allied operations at the theater level. The notification announced a temporary operational adjustment. Due to resource constraints and the current air denial environment, all non-combat functional personnel at Outpost Vyerk and associated forward positions were being redesignated as non-extraction priority. Extraction assets would not be committed for individuals whose medical assessment indicated they could not return to operational status within 48 hours. Non-extraction priority. The language was careful and dry and administrative. It was the kind of language that covered over things very precisely so you could look at it without having to see what it was covering. K. Vareth was reading the same terminal. He knew because she had gone very still. He watched her read it. He watched her reach the line he had reached and hold there and not move for a long time. Then she said something. A single phrase, very quiet. It had the sound of something she was saying to herself rather than to him. "What does that mean?" he said. She looked at him. She tapped the notification on the screen with one finger. Then she tapped herself in the center of the chest. Then she made a gesture he had seen Corvith soldiers make only once before, in a conversation about something that was finished, something that wasn't coming back. He got it. "That's not what it means," Marcus said. She looked at him with the expression that was doing math. "I'm not leaving you here," he said. He said it the way his grandmother had said specific things, without heat, without room for negotiation, with the quality of something that was simply what was true about the universe. That's not a thing that's happening." She said something. He didn't understand it. He was fairly confident it was the Corvith equivalent of "that's not your decision," or possibly "that doesn't make tactical sense," or possibly both simultaneously. "Okay," he said. "Walk me through the math." She looked at him for a moment. Then, slowly, with the patience of someone who had accepted that the exercise was absurd but was doing it anyway, she held up her hands, all three, fingers extended, and began. He couldn't follow all of it, but the shape of it was clear enough. She traced out the resource calculation, the risk assessment, the odds against his getting her out of a contested zone without transport, without air cover, with a weapon loadout that had been designed for individual infantry operations. She traced out the allocation logic. If he spent his effort on her, he wasn't spending it on his own survival, and she was a non-variable, and he was a variable, and the math said one survived or neither did. He listened to all of it. Then he said, "You left something out of the math." She waited. "You've got motor function back in 4 of your 6 limbs. It's partial, I know it's partial, but it's there. Another 12 hours of neural reconnection and I think you might have all 6, and you're a Cascade commander. In 36 hours, when the corridor shifts and extraction becomes viable, having a functional Cascade commander to walk out of here is worth more to the war effort than one infantry specialist who's been separated from his unit and is basically just eating rations and bothering aliens." She was absolutely still for a long moment. Then she made a sound, not the close enough sound. Something new. Something he didn't have a category for yet. It had the texture of a laugh but not the rhythm of one. It was the sound, he decided later, of someone encountering a style of logic they had not previously considered as a category of logic. "Also," Marcus said, "I already told you I'm not leaving you, so the math is kind of moot." She looked at him for a moment longer. Then she tapped the terminal screen closed, turned carefully to rest her back against the wall, and began the slow, deliberate work of testing her limb responses again. He took it as agreement. He spent the first 2 hours of their station time doing a systematic search of the facility for anything useful. What he found: 6 additional ration packs in a sealed emergency locker, a Corvith standard field medic kit that was actually designed for Corvith biology, 2 spare power cells for his rifle, a handheld terrain scanner with a cracked display that still functioned, and a Davari field communication unit that had been salvaged from somewhere and never disposed of. He showed the Davari unit to Kay Varath. She examined it, touched it with 2 fingers in a way that was clearly assessment, and then made a rapid series of sounds that had the quality of technical instruction. "I can't understand you," he said. She looked at the unit. She looked at him. She pointed at the unit, then pointed southeast toward the Allied main line. Then she made a short, sharp gesture that meant something he interpreted as, "This is how we tell them we're here." "You want to use it too," he stopped. "The Davari frequency. They won't be monitoring a signal on their own band. If we transmit on their tactical frequency, it'll read as ambient. But if we encode our beacon signal inside it..." She made a very specific gesture he hadn't seen before. It was an exact mirror of the gesture he made when someone in his unit finally got what he was saying. He spent the next 4 hours building the thing. It required the field-stripped components from 3 separate systems, the conductive wire from the med kit, and a creative interpretation of what the Davari unit's modulation hardware could be made to do. Kay Varath was his working partner throughout, guiding, indicating, testing signal output with sensory capabilities he didn't have. Her control over her upper body improved as the hours passed. By the time they had a working prototype, she was supporting herself against the wall with all 3 upper limbs, which meant the neural relay was bridging further with every hour. At the 13th hour, she stood up. It wasn't graceful. It was slow and careful, and she had to catch herself twice, and the lower 2 limbs were still intermittent. She moved like someone crossing ice for the first time, testing each step with absolute deliberateness. But she was upright. She was standing. She crossed the floor of the bunker under her own power, reached the wall, and turned. She looked at Marcus. He looked at her. "There you go," he said. She said something. Short, quiet. He didn't understand it, but it had the shape of something that didn't need translation. He activated the modified transmitter at hour 14. They picked it up. He knew this not because he received confirmation. The unit was transmit-only, but because the Davari tactical communications chatter he was monitoring on the salvaged unit's receiver shifted. Slightly. A single burst of traffic in a direction he wasn't expecting, which might mean anything or might mean that somewhere in the Allied rear area, a signals officer was staring at an anomaly on their board and asking someone to double-check it. It was the most he had. They waited. At hour 15, Vareth touched his arm. He'd learned to pay attention when she did this. He looked where she was looking. Through the gap in the relay station's roof, the section where the ceiling had buckled but not collapsed, the night sky was visible. The color of the cloud cover was changing. The Davari air denial assets used a particular kind of atmospheric seeding to maintain the corridor, and when the corridor was thinning it showed up as a shift in the electromagnetic spectrum, visible to Corvith visual organs as a specific color change. He couldn't see it, but she could. "How long?" he said. She held up her hand, 2 fingers. 2 hours. She made the close enough sound. He checked his weapon's loadout. He checked the terrain scanner. He reviewed the sensor array, still functioning, still showing the patrol pattern he'd been tracking, which had become somewhat predictable in its timing. The Davari were efficient. Efficient things had rhythms. Rhythms could be used. He told her the patrol pattern. He showed her the scanner. She studied the data with the focused attention of someone who knew what they were looking at, and after a moment she made a series of gestures that indicated a route, not the route he'd been planning, a more circuitous path that added distance but kept them in terrain that would interfere with the Davari sensor systems. "I didn't know that about the terrain," he said. She said something short and flat that he interpreted as, "I've been fighting on this planet longer than you have." "Fair," he said. At the beginning of hour 16, they came. Not rescue, not first. A Davari enforcement team, 4 operatives moving in tactical formation from the north, had been following their beacon trace. Or possibly the modified transmitter had drawn attention the wrong way. Or possibly a patrol had found their track. It didn't matter which. What mattered was 4 contacts on the scanner moving fast, and the corridor above them still a few degrees too warm for Allied aircraft. Marcus came up with the rifle braced and felt Vareth move beside him. She had taken the rifle he'd left leaning against the far wall. She couldn't stand fully. Her lower limbs were still intermittent, still finding their footing in the reconnected signals, but she could brace. She could hold. She had spent 8 months commanding warriors on this front, and everything about the way she settled into position said she had not forgotten how. "You take left," he said. "I have right." She didn't understand the words, but she was already oriented left. The first contact came through the north wall breach. Marcus put 2 rounds in it and moved. The relay station was full of angles, the collapsed sections, the overturned equipment, the buckled door frames, and he'd spent 2 hours learning them by feel while Vareth was running diagnostics. He knew where the cover was. He moved between it, drawing fire, letting the Davari track the more aggressive contact while Vareth, steady and nearly silent at the far wall, worked on her own timeline. He'd seen the Corvith fight before. He'd never seen one fight like this, from a fixed position, one-handed on the weapon and 2 hands braced against the wall, the damaged lower limbs not fully answering but compensating, finding new weight distributions with the unhurried precision of a system recalibrating in real time. She was adapting in the middle of the fight, not managing a deficit, finding a different way to do what she knew how to do. He thought about his grandmother. He thought, she would have liked this. She would have said, "That's a person who understands how things work." The fourth contact came from the east approach, and he almost missed it. He felt rather than heard the displacement of air, and turned and fired on instinct, and the shot was low but enough. The contact went down and stayed down, and Marcus was already moving back toward cover. When the echo of the last shot faded, there was silence. He looked across the bunker. Kay Vareth was standing. Both lower limbs, all 6 limbs operational. She was leaning slightly left. The lower right was still uncertain. He could see the micro-corrections she was making, but she was standing under her own power in the middle of a firefight she had just helped finish. She looked at him. He looked at her. "I feel like I should say something profound," Marcus said, "but mostly I'm just glad you can walk." She said something that had, absolutely unmistakably, the rhythm of stop talking and let's go. They went. The corridor was clear 15 minutes after they left the station. He knew this because a heavy Allied transport came in low and fast from the southeast, running navigation lights, which meant the pilots thought they were clear, which meant the corridor was gone. He popped his emergency flare. The transport banked. In the time they waited, 4 minutes, the transport dropping to a hover, the crew taking an extremely long moment to process what they were seeing, which was a single human infantry specialist with a weapon across his back and a Corvith Cascade commander beside him, both of them upright, both of them apparently functional. Kay Vareth said something to him. He looked at her. He'd learned enough of her silences to know this one had weight in it. "I still can't understand you," he said. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said a short phrase, very clearly, in extremely poor but recognizable standard, the shared human-adjacent lingua franca of the Allied command. "Why did you stay?" He thought about it. He thought about his grandmother and his father's shop, and the specific weight of the circuit actuator coil he'd pulled from his targeting system to bridge a gap in alien neural tissue because it was close enough, close enough, close enough. "Because you were in the ditch," he said, "and I don't leave people in ditches." She looked at him for another moment. In all the months since, he has never been able to fully describe what was in that look. It wasn't gratitude, exactly. Gratitude had a direction, and this was more like something being reconsidered, a category being adjusted, a calculation being revised with a new variable that didn't have a name yet. Then she made a sound, not the close enough sound. A new sound, one she had apparently decided to develop specifically for this situation. He didn't know what it meant, but it felt like noted. It felt like filed. It felt like I will carry this. The transport settled onto the wet ground. The crew chief, a young human woman who looked like she had been through her own version of the last 48 hours, leaned out of the hatch and stared at them for a moment. "Sergeant Webb." "Yeah." And the crew chief was staring at Kay Vareth in the specific way of someone recalibrating a significant assumption. "Is that a—" "Cascade Commander Kay Vareth," Marcus said. "She needs a medical evaluation for neural relay function, probably Corvith specialist if you have access to one, and tell command she's operational. Use those words. They'll know what it means." The crew chief was still staring. Then she stepped back from the hatch and gestured them in. Kay Vareth moved past him toward the transport. She walked slowly, but she walked, each step deliberate, each step another test of the repaired pathway, the bridged gap, the close enough conductor carrying signals it hadn't been designed to carry through tissue it hadn't been designed to touch. She paused at the hatch. She looked back at him. She said one word in standard. She'd been practicing it since about hour 8, he suspected, though she'd been waiting for the right moment. Her pronunciation was exact, deliberate, chosen with the care of someone selecting a word from a language, not their own because that language happened to contain the right word, and no other word would do. "Unthinkable," she said. He looked at her. He thought about the 4 minutes, the extraction team that had been here and left, The notification with its careful, administrative language. The math she had shown him that left no room for what he'd done. "Yeah, well," he said, "somebody has to be." He climbed in after her. The hatch closed. The transport lifted, the ground falling away below them, the ruined relay station, the wet ground, the debris field where he'd found her in the dark. From above it looked small. From above everything that had almost ended there looked small and wrong-sized for what it had actually contained. He sat down. He was very tired. Across from him, Kay Vareth sat with her back straight and all 6 limbs arranged with the precise dignity of a senior commander who intended to arrive at whatever came next looking exactly like herself, and nothing else. He was asleep before they crossed the edge of the former corridor. He learned later, much later, from a Corvith liaison officer who had followed the report with the particular interest of someone trying to understand a data point that didn't fit the model, that Kay Vareth had submitted a full technical debrief of the neural relay repair on the day after her medical evaluation. The debrief had been circulated among Corvith medical engineers and had become the basis for a new field repair protocol that had, in the following 8 months, been used to recover 31 Corvith warriors from battlefield neural lattice injuries that the previous protocol had classified as non-recoverable. 31. The liaison officer had seemed to think Marcus would want to know this. He was right. Marcus spent a long time sitting with the number. The liaison officer also told him something else. That in the Corvith Cascade Command record, Kay Vareth's account of the incident had included a notation he had never seen used in a Corvith military document before. It was a term from an older register of Corvith language, pre-military, philosophical. The liaison officer's best translation of it was something like, acted outside the logic of species and interest, acted from the part of the self that knows a person is a person. The entry had been flagged, apparently, because command archivists weren't sure which category to file it in. Military commendation, operational record, something else. Marcus, when he heard this, thought about Kay Vareth standing in the ruined relay station with all 6 limbs functioning, holding a rifle she could barely support, completing a sentence that had started when he decided not to leave her in the crater. He thought about the close enough sound. He thought about a young girl in eastern Georgia, standing in his grandmother's kitchen, being told as if it were physics, load-bearing, inviolable, part of the structure of the universe. You don't leave people in ditches. He thought the category is obvious. The category is why we're still worth anything. He thought file it there. He hoped, wherever they'd each been sent after the transport landed, that Kay Vareth was walking. He hoped she was walking into whatever came next with all 6 limbs, and the knowledge that, when her own people's math had placed no value on her survival, one human soldier had looked at the math and politely declined to agree with it. He hoped she knew that the math had always been wrong. He thought she did. She'd seemed like someone who could hold that knowledge and know what to do with it, carry it forward, use it, teach it to the next Cascade commander who ran the numbers on someone left in a crater and came up with abandon. That was the thing about the unthinkable. Once someone did it, once someone stood in the rubble and said, "No, this is not the calculation I'm running," it became slightly more thinkable. The next person who found someone in a ditch had a data point, a precedent, a small proof that the universe would not, in fact, collapse if you chose the person over the math. Marcus Webb believed this. His grandmother had believed this. He suspected, based on available evidence, that Kay Vareth had come to believe it too. That felt like enough. That felt like more than enough. Outside the window of the billet where he finally slept for 12 uninterrupted hours, the rain had stopped. The alien sky was doing something complex and orange-violet on the horizon. He lay on his back and looked at it through the cracked ceiling panel and thought about circuits, about the path a signal takes when the direct route is broken, about the way A close enough conductor can carry what it was never designed to carry if you believe in the continuity of the signal more than you believe in the rules about what's supposed to connect to what. He thought his father would have understood this. His father would have said, of course. He would have said, everything that ever worked can be made to work again. He closed his eyes. He slept. He found out 6 weeks later what had happened in the 48 hours after the transport dropped them at the forward medical station. He found out because a Corvith Signals officer named Vrethka came to find him. Vrethka was one of K. Vareth's subordinates, one of the 3 Cascade elements she had been coordinating on the day the airstrike came in. Vrethka was alive because K. Vareth had been coordinating the elements. Vrethka walked like someone who had recently been reminded that walking was not guaranteed, with the deliberateness of a person who was aware of each step as a thing they had chosen. Vrethka found Marcus at the vehicle depot, where he had been reassigned pending his unit's reconstitution, doing the kind of maintenance work that accretes to soldiers who are technically present but not currently attached to anything. Marcus was elbow-deep in a relay drive housing when a shadow fell across him, and he looked up to find a Corvith officer standing 3 meters away and watching him with what he had learned to read as attention. He straightened up. He wiped his hands on a rag that was not adequate to the job. Vrethka said something. Then, apparently arriving at the same assessment K. Vareth had about standard, switched to it. She sends. Marcus waited. The protocol is named, Vrethka said. She asked me to tell you, the repair protocol you made. In the medical record, she named it. Named it what? Vrethka said a phrase in Corvith. Then, in standard close web method, some of the medical engineers wanted a technical name. She said no. Marcus looked at the relay drive housing. He thought about his father's shop, about the man who had taught him that the name of a repair didn't matter, that what mattered was whether the signal got through. That seems excessive, he said. 31, Vrethka said. Marcus looked at him. 31 recovered in 6 weeks, 8 more in assessment. The technique was already known as a possibility in theory. The practical sequence, yours, this was not known. A pause. She said you would say it was obvious. It was pretty obvious, Marcus said. She said to tell you it was not obvious to anyone except you. Another pause, shorter. She says to tell you she is walking, full function restored. She says you will want to know this. He did want to know this. He had been wanting to know this every day for 6 weeks and had not known how to ask through the appropriate channels, because he wasn't sure what channel would handle the question, a human infantry specialist, asking whether a Corvith Cascade commander had recovered from the repair job he'd done in a bombed-out relay station in the middle of the night, with components from his own helmet. Tell her he stopped. He tried to find the right shape for what he wanted to say across the gap of 2 languages and 2 biologies, and everything that had happened in a hole in the ground while the rain came down. Tell her I'm glad. Vrethka looked at him with the expression of someone evaluating whether that was the entirety of the message. That's it, Vrethka said. Yeah, Marcus said, she'll know what it means. Vrethka seemed to accept this, or at least to accept that Marcus believed it. The officer inclined the upper portion of his body, a gesture Marcus recognized as formal acknowledgement, and departed. Marcus stood in the vehicle depot in the particular silence that follows information you've been waiting for and not known how to name. The relay drive housing was open in front of him, its components exposed, the signal pathway interrupted and waiting to be restored. He picked up the driver and got back to work. Later, much later, 2 years and a different front and a theater commendation he didn't know what to do with, Marcus Webb would be asked by a military correspondent writing a piece about Allied cooperation and the evolving relationship between human and Corvith forces to describe what had happened at Outpost Vyerk, not the technical details. The correspondent had those from the official reports. She wanted to know what he had been thinking when he decided to stay. He thought about it for a long time. It was not a complicated thought, but it took a long time to find the right words for it, because the words needed to be honest, and they needed to be simple, and those two requirements together are sometimes harder than they look. "I wasn't thinking about the war," he said finally. "I wasn't thinking about the alliance or the strategy or what she was worth to the command structure. I was thinking about a person in a ditch." A pause. "And I was raised by someone who was very specific about what you do when you find a person in a ditch." The correspondent wrote it down. She seemed to want more, so he gave her more. "The thing is," he said, "the whole calculation, the one that says cut your losses, leave the non-functional asset, maximize your own survival probability, it's not wrong exactly. The math checks out, but it's math about a different question than the one I was answering. I wasn't answering what maximizes my survival. I was answering, what kind of person am I going to be when I walk out of this?" He thought about Varath standing in the relay station with all 6 limbs working, with a weapon in hand, standing because some technician in eastern Georgia had taught his son that everything that ever worked could be made to work again. And I needed the answer to be the right one. I needed it very badly. The correspondent printed all of it. The piece ran in 3 languages, including 2 Corvith regional dialects, and 1 Davari-adjacent translation for intercepted distribution in the neutral zones. Marcus did not know about the translation for the neutral zones until much later. He thought about it when he found out. He thought, He thought maybe that's what it does. You find a person in a ditch and you make a decision that has no tactical logic, and you think it's a small, private, stubborn thing, just you and your grandmother's voice in your head and the specific weight of a piece of targeting hardware repurposed against its design. And then it travels. The small, private, stubborn thing turns out not to be contained. It moves through the record. It gets a name. 31 people walk who weren't supposed to walk. A correspondent translates it for zones that weren't supposed to hear it. And somewhere in the accumulated math of a long war, the variable that wasn't supposed to count turns out to count enormously. Marcus Webb thought, that's the thing about humans. Not the strength or the aggression or the famous pain tolerance or the way we fight when cornered. Those are real. But the thing that actually surprises them, the thing that the Davari intelligence models consistently failed to predict, that Corvith strategic analysts wrote papers about for years after the war's first decade, that the neutral zone diplomats kept citing in negotiation rooms where no one could agree on anything else, was this. The refusal. The flat, stubborn, non-tactical refusal to accept that a person in a ditch was not worth stopping for. It wasn't logical. It wasn't efficient. It had no entry in any enemy combat manual. It could not be modeled because it did not respond to incentives or threats or resource calculations. It was just a fact about humans, like the fact of their biology or their language family. A load-bearing fact. A fact about the structure of the universe, or at least the part of the universe that humans occupied. You find a person in a ditch, you stop. Not because it was smart, not because the math worked out, because you looked at the math and found that you cared about a different question. That was the unthinkable part. That was always the unthinkable part. And the thing about unthinkable things, the thing Varath had been working out in that look she'd given him at the transport hatch, the thing she had been filing away to carry forward and teach and use, is that once someone does them, they become slightly more thinkable. They enter the record. They become a data point in the long argument about what's possible and what isn't, about what can be bridged and what can't, about what a close enough conductor can carry when you believe in the signal more than you believe in the gap. Marcus Webb believed in the signal. He always had. His father had taught him that. His grandmother had taught him why. And somewhere on the other side of a war that was still going, Varath was walking, all 6 limbs, full function. Cascade commander, operational, which was worth more to the war effort than one infantry specialist who'd been doing math that didn't make sense but kept coming up with the right answer. He was glad about that. He was very, very glad about that. He went back to work. There was a thing that happened in the 4th year of the war that Marcus only heard about secondhand, from a medic named Soares, who had been attached to a Corvus forward unit during the push at Relay Corridor 7. Soares told him over bad coffee in a prefab mess hall, 3 months after the armistice talks started, and the war became the kind of thing you could talk about in past tense, carefully, the way you talk about an animal that might not be fully dead. A Corvus Cascade commander had been coordinating the breakout at Corridor 7. The breakout had gone sideways in the 3rd hour when the Davari activated a second-line defensive position that intelligence had missed, and the human infantry element attached to the Corvus unit had taken heavy casualties in the first exchange. 3 soldiers were down in the open, between the lines, in a section of ground that had no cover and was under active fire. Soares had been trying to work out how to get to them. The math wasn't working. The math had no solution that didn't result in Soares also being in the open under active fire, which was not a solution. Then the Cascade commander had moved. She'd gone forward into the open, under fire. She'd gone forward with 2 of her subordinate warriors, and they had, with their larger frames and superior armor, created a mobile cover position over the 3 downed human soldiers while Soares got them out. One of the Corvus subordinates had taken significant damage doing this. The Cascade commander had taken a glancing strike to the right shoulder plate, which cracked it. She'd gotten all 3 of the human soldiers back to the line. Soares had been trying to understand this. Soares had gone to the Cascade commander afterward when the immediate situation was stable and tried to ask why. The Cascade commander had apparently looked at Soares for a long moment. Then she'd said, in standard, "Person in a ditch." Soares had not understood the reference. Marcus did. He sat with his bad coffee and his hands around the warm cup and thought about Kay Vareth and the ruined relay station, working out the math in real time, loading a new variable that didn't have a name yet. He thought about her saying, "I will carry this." He thought about the thing that travels when you make a decision that has no tactical logic, how it moves through the record, how it gets a name, how it turns up 4 years later in a different firefight where a different Cascade commander looked at 3 people in the open and ran a completely different calculation than the one she'd been taught. Who was the Cascade commander? Marcus asked. Soares named her Kay Vareth. He hadn't known she was in that sector. He hadn't been tracking her movements, had no reason to, no mechanism. 2 people who had survived a thing together and then gone back to the enormous war that contained them both. He hadn't known. He knew now. He sat for a long time after Soares left, watching other people come and go in the mess hall, watching the particular quality of tired that fills a room when the shooting might be stopping and nobody quite believes it yet. He thought about signals. He thought about pathways. He thought about the specific insistence of a circuit that still has something to say, still has a signal trying to bridge the gap, needing only someone stubborn enough to believe that close enough is close enough. She had carried it forward. She had done the unthinkable, and then she had carried it forward and used it, passed it through herself into the record of the war, into the accumulating argument about what was possible. Person in a ditch. 4 words in a language not her own, deployed with precision in a moment that needed them. He thought his grandmother would have loved this. He thought this is what it does. This is what it actually does, the thing that cannot be modeled or predicted or accounted for in any resource calculation. You find a person in a ditch, you stop, and then the stopping moves. The stopping travels. The stopping becomes, eventually, its own kind of force in the world. He finished his coffee. He threw the cup away. Outside, the sky of this planet was doing its alien thing with the light, layers of color, orange, violet, deep blue. A sunset that looked like a painting made by something that had never seen Earth and was working from description. He stood in the doorway and looked at it for a minute. He thought about Kay Vareth looking at him in the relay station with her whole alien face full of the calculation she was revising. He thought about her asking why. He thought about the moment, the transport hatch, the rain on the ground, the words she had chosen from a language she was still learning, because that language had the right word, and she wanted to use it exactly. Unthinkable. Yeah, he thought, somebody has to be. He went back inside. There was work to do. There was always, on the edge of armistice, enormous amounts of work to do. The work of things stopping being as complicated as the work of things starting. He had a unit now, reconstituted and then some, with people in it he would walk through fire for, and who he was fairly certain would walk through fire for him, and they needed him to be present and functional and paying attention. He went back to them. He walked back to them with the specific stride of someone who understood something about signals and pathways, and the load a close enough conductor can carry when you trust the signal more than you trust the gap. He walked back to them with his grandmother's voice in the part of his mind that carried things worth carrying, saying what she had said so many times that it had become weather, had become the atmosphere he moved through. You find a person in a ditch. You stop. You always stop. Not because you calculated the outcome, not because someone was watching, not because the math worked out or the species matched or the protocols covered it, because you were a person and they were a person, and that was the only equation that had ever mattered. That was the unthinkable thing. That was always the unthinkable thing. And the remarkable thing, the thing that the Davari had never managed to model, and the Corvith had spent 4 years writing carefully measured papers about, and the neutral zone diplomats had cited in room after room as evidence of something they couldn't quite name. The remarkable thing was not that humans did it. The remarkable thing was that it turned out to be contagious.